Okay, so this is my presentation on St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, presented by me, Ethan Matthew. So, why do the saints matter? Before we look at St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas specifically, I think it's really important to understand why we even honor the saints in the first place. The church doesn't honor saints because they were perfect or because they had easier lives. Instead, saints are people who tried to live according to Christ's teachings and trusted God, especially when life became difficult. One thing I find really interesting is that every saint is different, and they all show that there are different ways to pursue holiness. Some were missionaries, some were teachers, some were kings, and some had very quiet lives. I feel like this shows that there isn't one path to holiness, as I said earlier, and that God calls different people to serve Him in different ways. As we look at Augustine and Aquinas, I think it's easy to notice that even though their personalities were completely different, they both completely dedicated their lives to following Christ. So, Augustine's early life. St. Augustine was born in the year 354 in North Africa, and there's a map of North Africa on this slide, which is now a part of modern day Algeria. At the time, this region was all a part of the Roman Empire. So, from a very young age, Augustine was extremely intelligent. He loved learning and became especially skilled at rhetoric, which is the art of public speaking and just persuasion and things like that. Because of his intelligence, he eventually became a teacher and he gained so much respect. But even though he was successful, he wasn't living a Christian life. Later, in one of his books, he openly admitted that when he was younger, he cared more about pleasure and chasing worldly goods instead of chasing God. He constantly searched for happiness in the world, but nothing really satisfied him. One thing I appreciate about Augustine is how honest he is about his mistakes and that he shows that past mistakes don't define you. He admits where he went wrong because he wants others to learn from his experience. To me, his story reminds me that success, money, and popularity don't make someone happy, which the saying, money can't buy happiness. So, Augustine had many of those things, but he still felt like something was missing. Conversion. The turning point in Augustine's life came largely because of his mother, Saint Monica. Saint Monica was a devoted Christian who spent years praying for her son's conversion. Even when Augustine ignored Christianity, she never stopped believing that God would eventually reach him. One day, Augustine was sitting alone in a garden, feeling frustrated with his life. While he was there, he heard the voice of a child singing the words, "Take and read." He believed this was God speaking to him. So then, he picked up a Bible that was nearby and opened it to a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans. This passage encouraged him to stop living a sinful life and instead put all of his faith, time, and trust in Christ. Augustine later wrote that this moment completely changed his life. Soon afterward, he decided to become a Christian and was baptized by St. Ambrose. Eventually, Augustine became the Bishop of Hippo, where he spent decades preaching, writing, helping the poor, and defending the Christian faith. It's incredible to think that somebody who once rejected Christianity eventually became one of its greatest leaders. And I think Augustine's life is encouraging because it reminds us that no one is beyond God's mercy. There was no mistake too great. And no matter what mistake someone has made, it's always possible to change direction and begin living for Christ. Augustine's legacy. After Augustine became a bishop, he spent the rest of his life serving the church. He preached hundreds of sermons, wrote hundreds of books, and answered difficult questions about Christianity and helped guide Christians through a time when the Roman Empire was about to fall apart. Two of his books are especially famous. The first one is called Confessions. It's often considered one of the first autobiographies ever written. In the book, Augustine tells the story of his own life, from the mistakes he made as a young man to the moment he finally gave his life to God. What makes the book unique is that it's written almost like one long prayer. Augustine isn't just telling readers what happened, he's talking directly to God about how his life has changed. That's one reason why it's still read almost 1,600 years later. His second major book is The City of God. Augustine wrote wrote it after Rome was attacked, when many people believed Christianity was responsible for the empire's problems. In response, Augustine explained that Christians shouldn't place all of their hope in earthly kingdoms because every nation eventually rises and falls. Instead, our ultimate hope should be in God's kingdom, which lasts forever. Augustine also taught a lot about God's grace. He believed that no one person can earn salvation by just being a good person. Instead, salvation is a gift from God, and our job is to respond to that gift through faith and by trying to live according to Christ's teachings and to give our life to God. Many of Augustine's ideas influenced the later church teachings that are still reviewed and studied today. St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, let's go forward almost 1,000 years to another saint, St. Thomas Aquinas. Thomas was born around the year 1225 in Italy into a wealthy and noble family. Because of this important status, his family expected him to become an important political or church leader with a comfortable life. Instead, Thomas surprised everybody by joining the Dominican order, which was dedicated to preaching, teaching, and living a very simple life. His family was so upset by this decision that they locked him inside their castle for a year, hoping he would change his mind. But Thomas stayed committed to his decision and eventually joined the Dominicans anyways. As a student, Thomas was super quiet. Some classmates even gave him the nickname the Dumb Ox because they thought he didn't have much to say. But one of his teachers supposedly responded by saying that one day the whole world would hear his voice. It turned out to be true, as Thomas became one of the greatest theologians in Christian history and one of the church's most respected leaders and saints. Faith and reason. One of the things that makes Thomas Aquinas very unique and famous is because he explained the relationship between faith and reason. Even today, some people think science and religion can't go together, that they are completely opposite of one another. Thomas disregarded this idea. He believed that because God created the universe and the human mind, studying the world through this science and this reasoning can help us understand God's creation and help us cultivate this deeper relationship with Him. He often used the writings of other ancient Greek philosophers, like Aristotle, to help explain Christian beliefs. Some people were pretty skeptical about this philosophy, but Thomas believed that truth is truth, and if something is actually true, it can't contradict God's revelation. This idea became the foundation for Catholic education. It's one reason Catholic schools and other universities encourage students to study science and religion cohesively, instead of seeing them as different subjects. And I think that shows Thomas's influence and why he's so relevant today. He reminds us that asking questions isn't a sign of weakness, but rather that it's intelligence and it's important to grow. And this shows that asking honest, deep questions can help us understand our faith even more deeply. Thomas Aquinas wrote an enormous number of books during his lifetime, but his most famous work, above all of the other ones, is Summa Theologica. The goal of this book was to organize Catholic teaching into a big, clear explanation. Thomas asked hundreds of important questions about God, prayer, virtue, faith, mercy, heaven, and so many other topics. Before each question, he carefully presented different viewpoints before explaining what he believed was the best answer. It's almost like reading a debate instead of a regular textbook. Another famous part of this work is what's called the 5 ways. These refer to 5 different philosophical arguments that try to show why belief in God is reasonable, and rather than depending on scripture, he used observation and logic to show why God exists. Along with this, he had this idea called natural law. This teaches that because God created humans with reason, we are capable of recognizing basic moral truths, like the importance of justice and honesty and other Christian values. Even though Thomas was one of the smartest people of his time, People who knew him often described him as humble. He believed that learning wasn't about being famous or status or proving other people wrong or anything like that, but instead it was about how knowledge can always help us serve others and help us use our God given talents to serve God Himself. And I think that's such a big lesson we can all learn from him today, that intelligence is valuable, but it's even better when it's combined with being humble. So, comparing St. Thomas and St. Aquinas. Now that we've looked at both of the saints' lives, I think it's interesting to compare them because even though they were very different people, they had the same goal. Augustine's life was centered around conversion. He spent years searching for happiness and success, relationships, and worldly pleasures before realizing that only God could ever give him that satisfaction and that joy he needed. His story reminds us that everybody makes mistakes, but nobody is beyond God's love or forgiveness. Thomas Aquinas had a very different path. He was committed to his faith from a young age and spent most of his life studying, teaching, and helping people understand Christianity. Instead of being known for a dramatic conversion, he's known for showing that faith and reason can exist and should belong together. Even though their stories are pretty different, they have a lot in common. Both dedicated their lives to serving the church entirely. Both became teachers who helped educate millions of people and help them all understand Christianity better. And both practiced humility despite their immense intelligence and influence. I think they also balanced each other out well. Augustine reminds us to pay attention and trust our relationship with God, while Aquinas tells us to use the minds God gave us. Together, both these saints show that being a Christian involves trust, loving God, and always seeking the truth and honesty. So how are these people models of Christian life? I think Augustine teaches us one of Christianity's most important lessons, which is God never gives up on people. Although this is shown several times through the Bible, like with the parable of the lost sheep, Augustine lived a life that was different before his conversion, before he encountered God. He showed that you can completely change the direction of your life. St. Thomas Aquinas teaches us something just as important. He reminds us that loving God doesn't mean ignoring our logical side. It's important to ask questions and to accept everything without doubt, which is what is called the mystery of faith. But Thomas also showed that this can strengthen our relationship with God because all truth comes from him. And like I said earlier, both of the saints showed incredible humility. They openly admitted their failures instead of pretending they were perfect. Although they were super smart, they never let their knowledge make them prideful. And I think that's another thing we can all learn from them today, because although I won't probably become a famous saint or theologian, I can still imitate their example by having a growth mindset, staying humble, and being open to learning and growing in my relationship with God. So, conclusion. So after looking at both of these saints, I think it's easy to see why the church continues to honor them. Augustine teaches us that no one's far from God's mercy and that we can always turn back to God and that it's never too late. St. Thomas Aquinas shows us that faith and reason can and should work together. We should ask questions and use our intelligence to glorify God. And even though these men lived centuries ago, they're super relevant today. We all have doubts or we all have questions about our faith and religion, and both of them show us the importance of when this happens, how we should seek God and seek truth. And that's my presentation. Thank you.